back. My name is Nick Dagan Best. This is my little private astrology stream. I have one of my favorite people as a guest again today, Samuel Reynolds. Welcome back, Sam. How you doing?
Hey Nick, thank you. How are you?
I'm pretty good. I'm pretty good.
How's
We
this?
missed.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say we missed you. You were here two
Oh,
weeks ago. We've this is your fourth visit on the live stream in the past. I don't know, 6 weeks or so.
that's true.
Yeah, something like that. And yeah, you gave me a chance to go through all my slides from this article I wrote years ago that I'm trying to put together a video for. And thank you for helping me sort through all that information. As you can tell, like, that's what I'm up against. There's obviously way too much to sort of present in a concise video, but I wanted to just run through all the material and talk about it because I hadn't revisited it in a long time, and it was certainly on my mind to update it with the whole Venus synodic system, that the Venus synodic map that I've put together. So yeah, it's that. I think we got a lot out of the conversation, and I'm really looking forward to. I've looked through your slideshow for today's conversation. I'm really excited to get into this and to hear everything you have to say. I think the audience is in for a real treat. Sorry, what were you about to say before
No, just
I
a little small
started
talk,
all
which I
that?
think is still helpful.
Okay,
So,
yeah.
since a friend of mine just said that uh, of his Leo friends, this year has been kind of, meh, blah. And I was like,
Mhm.
oh, okay, I don't know. I mean, I'm out of touch with people's sun signs and things like that in my more immediate circle. I deal with individuals. Um, So I don't know if I have an aggregate of like what's happening with Leos. I don't know. So I thought
Right.
I ask a Leo, how has it been for you with this Venus retrograde and everything?
Yeah, I mean, my life right now is very sort of in stasis. I'm in the process of moving my family from one end of the planet, and there's just a lot of complications involved. Literally
So are you moving?
going from
So
this.
you're moving. Yeah, you're about to tell me. You guys are moving from South Africa, or are you going to keep being in South Africa and Canada?
The latter is the plan, but at the very least, the family is moving here.
Okay.
My stepkids are going to university here, and we've had this ridiculous, long, drawn out adoption process for Ayanda that she's been raising. Well, Anna was raising her even before I got to South Africa, but I've been
Mm-hmm.
raising her as
I
a
met her. I
yeah,
met her.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been raising her as a second father since she was 5, and she's 12 now. And yeah, without going into all the
Yeah, don't
absurd
get too
details
personal.
behind, yeah,
Yeah.
no, just a lot of paperwork, and we're on the verge of resolving it, but it's not quite resolved there. But Ayanda was born in South Africa, but because her parents were not South African, they're from Zimbabwe. She only has a Zimbabwe passport, a country she's never been to. That's the kind of situation that you get into down there. So yeah, I mean, for one thing, we need Ayanda with us. Ayanda needs to be with us. She's especially close to her siblings and certainly to Anna and I. Um, but also, they're going to go from having this one passport to, well, she's going to have Anna's South African and then my Canadian, and ostensibly, yeah, she'll finish out her school years here. And so much up in the air. But to answer your question, this summer is just like, yeah, a matter of holding this space in Canada. Anna has to attend to her business across the pond, and so she's been back and forth, and so there's long periods of where we can't be together and we want to be. So yeah, I wouldn't say like I'm miserable or it sucks, but I am just really missing my family. I'm not necessarily where I want to be. I mean, I love Vancouver, but I'm very attached to Cape Town. So yeah, it's just that kind of situation where not everything can happen overnight, and there's a lot of waiting for things to actualize. you know. So
Right.
that's all, you know, that's where I am. You know, besides that, I got to keep going.
Yeah, of course.
Thankfully we live in a world with video calls and stuff like that. I mean, I'm in touch with the
Right.
family, of
Yeah.
course, but yeah, it's hard. It's not easy.
Yeah, I mean, I'll weigh in on the Moon and Leo front, how that's been for me. But yeah, he said, my friend was like, oh, well, Leos are normally extravagant. I mean, he gets somewhat into sun signs. I mean, the more I do astrology, I think sun signs and talking about what I call sinology is fun, but I don't take it seriously. I think it's interesting in that sense. But I think a lot of people, it's a good starting point related to it. And he was just saying, um, he asked me, have you noticed that Leo season hasn't been very Leo-y? Think about Leos in your life. Has there been extravagance and celebration? And I'm like, I don't know if I've ever noticed that each year. Um, and I'm appreciative for the people who are weighing in. Stephanie Apuba, so welcome, and Real Darko Arts. I don't know who that is, but hello, and Misty Radford, thank you. But yeah, for me as a moon in Leo, I would say it's translated as, again, like you said, stasis, some measure of things. And yeah, maybe I, I guess I've been making some different expenditures. So I got like a high-end camera. Well, I don't know if it's high-end, but I got a camera and Sony, and bought a tripod and a telescope because I want to do some more pictures of the sky. I'm not going to try to be like Gary Caton,
Yeah,
our colleague Gary Caton. If you guys don't know about Gary Caton, you should follow him
takes
on
beautiful
Instagram.
photo. Yeah,
Yeah, dream astrologer. He takes great pictures of the sky. So I want to do some of that since I'm out in this beautiful vista. So that's
yeah.
maybe been my Leo, because I'm out in. For those who don't know, I'm in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So yeah, I want to take more pictures of the sky. So that's kind of where my Leo ness. Oh, and I did get a PS5. So I guess I'm I'm honoring the Leo ness in that way.
A PS5, you mean a video
Um,
game console? Is that,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, okay. I'm like, I know nothing about video games. I would never
Okay,
have
that's right.
I would never have an astrology database if I had been playing video games. So I made my choice. I made my choices way back when. Yeah. But okay, congratulations.
Yeah, well, yeah, well, you can do both,
PS5 sounds
Nick. You
like
can
fun.
play. I was wondering how much you
No,
play.
not with me. This is my
You don't
play.
play?
I mean,
You do any
no, no.
kind of play? Speaking of Leo?
I hike. I hike. I go for
Okay.
nice long hikes. I put on an audiobook on my earbuds and I go for a nice long hike. I hike up in the
Okay.
mountains here. That is the great thing about Vancouver is the space that you have.
Yeah.
The nature, the connection to nature. It's an urban metropolis, but it's so deeply connected to the nature around it, and it's really accessible. So that is a great thing about this place. So that's what I do. But aside from hiking, no, I mean, I watch a little YouTube, I suppose, when I'm eating. Uh, like the way you used to uh, eat mac and
Watch your
cheese
cartoons?
in front of the
Okay.
cartoons, yeah, that kind of thing. Um, but aside from that, I'm always on fire. I'm always reading or making charts and making notes, and yeah, that's been
That's
my life
that's
all
your pleasure.
along.
That's your
Yeah, that
that's your
really is
Leo, right?
that's where I get my kicks. Yeah, and it is played. I mean, Solar Fire is like this PS5 to me. I mean,
Got
I
you.
do think that the technology needs to be updated, and I think it will be.
Oh
There's a
my
lot
God.
more, as things move on, and this is something Patrick and I are talking a lot about, and
Oh yeah?
you can see it stirring. Well, yeah. Patrick and I are well, we're working out a lot of the different things that we would like, AI adjacent astrology software to be able to do, which involves a lot more sort of like yesterday's program. Um, we were talking about, speaking of Gary Caton, because this is something that Gary's looked at as well, but I think Patrick's even sort of taken this another level further, I showed Patrick how the loops are different when Venus goes retrograde, or when any planet goes retrograde. The loops look different depending on what part of the sky and what part of the zodiac are to the equinoctial and solstitial points and so forth. And yeah, he correctly, I think Gary had the same conclusion earlier, so I don't want to, Patrick sort of reintroduced this conclusion he came to, that it has to do with the planetary nodes, the planet's relationship to the planetary nodes, and that changes the sort of and what Patrick worked out is the sort of the angle. The reason the loops look different is not because the loop pattern is different, but it's a matter of perspective in terms of how Venus is tilted to, or how we're tilted towards Venus at the time of a given retrograde, in terms of, what sees. So it's a really, I'm not necessarily, it's illustrated so much better with the visual presentation that we're doing. But long story.
And her nodes are Gemini, right? Along Gemini Sag, or
Gemini Sag, yeah. And so you really see that. But on top of that, Patrick's been working out a method of calculating heliacal risings and settings for different places around the globe, and we're finding really interesting patterns to that. Like the more we study the Venus cycle in its own right, the more it's obvious, like whether or not the planet is visible or not is really important, and being able to get more. When I was studying Hellenistic astrology 20 whatever years ago, you were just given this mean value of 15 degrees. It was always acknowledged that it probably wasn't, an accurate degree, but just sort of sort of a mean placeholder to get a sense of when a planet was or was not visible. But obviously Venus is so much brighter than the other planets and might be visible sooner, earlier, at an earlier degree or an earlier range from the sun than the other planets. And there's so many things to consider. So yeah, we really want to sort of, reintroduce that sort of that three-dimensional view of astrology, like the stargazers of old would have had. This, this notion of, it's not just a matter of watching these little symbols move around a pie chart, but where you really have a sense of the location where planets are becoming visible, what the elevation is, and how long it would take. There's all these things to consider, and yeah, we're actually sort of working out how we would teach AI how to incorporate this and make its own astrological conclusions from it.
Oh, that's interesting. Can you hold on just for literally a second? I have to turn off this fan or turn it down. It's
sure.
kind of like, give me a chill.
Go ahead.
On.
All right. I'm just going to go through the comments here.
All right. Thank you all. So
I see Geo Sen says, hello, I recently became an astrologer for a phone service. I know both of you have had this experience in the past. Do you have any fun stories or advice for those following the same path? It's good training. It's good training. I think that's,
who says this weird, Geo? Oh, there it is. Yeah, now I see it. Yeah, I mean, so yeah. Nick and I both, as we relayed, or Nick relayed, both work for the same service. So my fun story, in a sense, which is like an aggregate of stories, that we can, and I can't wait to hear yours, Nick. So it was a British service. So I came to the conclusion at one point, jokingly, that I thought half of Britain was shagging each other, because people would call up and say, here I am. I'm born the 5th of the 6th, 1967. Could you tell me if this bloke I'm actually seeing, and I have his wife's information. Would you? Is he going to leave her? Is he going to divorce her? And I'm like, this was, and I would always get sort of those questions, and I'm like, what's going on? And I learned a lot more about Britain itself and some measure of British culture from that. And I also learned, obviously, some astrology, in terms of fine tuning, because just so those who don't know, and Gio, I guess you're going to discover, what happens is someone calls and they give their birth information, and you really have to do everything on the fly. Like you don't have any time to process the chart.
They're paying
The,
like £3 a minute. I mean, that's
right.
what it was. That's
Correct.
£2 pounds. So who knows what it costs
Yeah.
now? That's
So yeah,
expensive.
it's expensive. So you don't want to waste their time. I didn't. Now, you could be of the mindset, and I don't think this is ethical, so I'm giving my opinion. You could be of the mindset of like, well, however long it takes, and then, because you're going to get paid. But
Well, that was why. Sorry to interrupt,
yeah,
but that was why. What was great about the service we worked for in Britain, there was a law that for that kind of phone, after 20 minutes, the call would hang up. And so
right.
if the person did want to keep speaking to you, they would have to ring you up again.
Hmm.
But at least then, like there was some control, and I had no problem with that. I was really grateful to have that because, I mean, it never would have occurred to me to just sort of exploit the person, make it go on longer. But obviously, the risk is there. I was always just like mortified by how much these people were paying, and I wanted to do as good a job in as short a time as
Absolutely.
possible. But yeah, it was good that that law was there, and so I don't know if that's um, Geosen says they have seconds to do the
Yeah, I
reading.
think that's really difficult. I mean, like, you're going to have to figure out what you're going to focus in on for seconds. I mean, I I always would deal with the question, assuming that they were calling for a particular issue. Very rarely did I have someone calling me and like, "Oh, I just went to general reading." Um, so that did happen, but not too frequently. They usually wanted to know something about their health or and you're going to start to I think the important thing, Geo, and this is for everyone who is interested in such things, is figuring out your ethics. So for instance, with that example I gave, I didn't read for anyone else's I didn't read for anyone else who was not involved in that relationship. Like, so if it was like, well, I want to know about his wife, I don't care. And I don't think, I'm making a judgment call, but I don't think you should either. It's none of your business. So I didn't get involved. Even if they had the wife's information, I'm like, okay, it's one thing that you're shacking someone's husband and you want to say this on to me, and I'm not going to judge you severely or judge you that much, but I don't need to include, um, his wife or her wife or whatever, her husband. So these are the things that you have to start figuring out, for yourself. I did realize. Okay, I hope I don't offend anyone here, and then I want to hear your story, Nick, and then we can get to other business too. Um, I realized I didn't understand the Welsh. And I know that sounds messed up. I could understand the Irish brogue, the Scottish brogue, but some of the Welsh would call in, and then when they would give their names and the assemblage of letters that don't sound or look like
Right, yeah.
what they spell out. Yeah. What are you gonna
I
say, Nick?
I had no trouble understanding the Welsh, but indeed, you would ask them what town they're born in, and there would be like 5 consonants and then a letter Y and then a bunch of other consonants and then another letter Y. And then it would sound nothing like the way you understand the alphabet. But I didn't have any trouble understanding their accent. What would be hard for me was people calling from Aberdeen, Scotland, which is like the northern tip of Scotland.
Yeah, the farthest.
The
Yeah.
people would call from Glasgow or yeah, or anywhere further south, and Edinburgh or whatever. And yeah, no, I had no trouble understanding them. But if they called from Aberdeen, I swear, and I'd feel terrible. I'd feel like such a, you know, whatever, like a spoiled Westerner or whatever. Like,
Right.
oh, I just want to connect with this person who ostensibly is speaking English to me, and they might, I would literally have an easier time understanding Dutch.
Yeah. And
Like, it was just, yeah, I always really battled if they were from Aberdeen or that
yeah,
like really far north Scotland where the accent was just, I guess the difference between us is I had lived in England when I started working for Astro Lifelink rather, in 2001. I was living in the Netherlands, and then in 2002 I moved to England, and I stayed there for like 11 months while I was working for Astro Lifelink. So I did, part of my sort of formative period with the company was at least spent on that side of the pond, and a good chunk of it in England proper. And of course, also I'm Canadian, so there's just that bit more of a British thing in our, you know, in our
Your
culture,
makeup. Yeah,
ostensibly.
sure.
Yeah, yeah, you know, um, yeah, you know, more theater on afternoon TV and things like that. So yeah, basically the real challenge I'll say is, or the beauty of it. What I learned out of working that phone service was, I mean, this is part of the way I became the quote unquote human ephemeris, and I think anyone working that kind of service has to adopt that kind of familiarity with the ephemeris, where you already know, like, the game's up in front of you and you got to read it right away. But if you see, like, for instance, the person's got Aries rising, like, oh, okay, 3 years ago there was a Mars retrograde over their ascendant, maybe that's got something to do with where the person's at now, like maybe there's, or whatever the case may be, just being able to, like, summon up, when did they have their Jupiter transits, when did they have their Saturn transits, what age were they when the, you know, this planet went retrograde by secondary progression, and being able to do all that within a few seconds. That's what you have to do, let alone do all the other, you know, like, oh, this planet is trying that planet, you know, from this house to that house, let alone all that level of stuff. But just being able to orient yourself really quickly with, you know, what the nativity looks like, and how that nativity would have unfolded between the moment of birth and the moment when they're calling you up asking whatever they want to talk about.
Yeah.
And
No,
also,
you're spot on.
yeah, and also the downtime, you'd have a whatever, a 6, I think I often had like 6 or 8 hour shifts where I had to sit by the laptop and wait for the phone to ring. And um you know, sometimes hours would go by and the phone wouldn't ring. It wasn't always a very busy service. So that's how I wound up developing the database. I had a lot of time where I just had to sit at the laptop. The very reason I wanted to work as a professional astrologer was so that I could always be studying astrology. You know, it was always like studying astrology is first, and then being a professional astrologer is what supports my fascination with astrology. It's not the other way around. So yeah, I mean, this is how I got the database. I took advantage of the fact that I had to be by the computer. I couldn't be off, you know, doing whatever. And so I stuck to my work and learned
Well,
to enjoy it, learned to make it part of my, you know, how I enjoy my day.
yeah, and you're bringing up a really salient point, which I think is very important for contemporary astrologers. When I say contemporary astrologers, for those who've only been studying maybe for a few years,
Mm,
or those who've been studying maybe, I would say, less than a decade or whatever, I would say get an ephemeris, an actual physical ephemeris, you know, and read it like you might read a book. And you
okay.
can start from your year of birth or wherever. I mean, if you want to go back and read your grandma's or whatever, that's fine and fair. But one of the reasons why I would say, I mean, you don't have to memorize it like Nick Dagan best, but being
Yeah, no, you
familiar,
do have to memorize it like Nick Dagan best.
being
Everyone does.
being familiar with it, right? I think, and then knowing some measure the cycles, because just seeing it, because one of the problems that I would say of this digital age, and then it may even worsen a bit with AI, is you don't know what's happening on the back end. You don't know what's happening under the hood. You know, Nick and I both came of age in astrology where we had to learn how to do a chart by hand. We didn't have to learn actually, but we did go through the NCGR process for the
Yeah.
exams to learn to do it. And that really opens your eyes up to the astronomy and the math behind it. And then you may even discover when a chart that's been calculated by a computer or whatever is wrong, right? And that either means that you inputted the data wrong or some measure of their, you know, calculations are off. Like, and that can happen. I just saw it with a program I'm working with, and they made the correction, so everything's fine. But you know, I put in the information for a chart, and I could tell it was wrong because the position of the sun. I was like, "There's no way this person could be a fifth house sun born at 1:20 p.m." Right? It doesn't make any sense. But I know that because I know how I would construct a chart. So I really do think that's important. And then going along with Nick's point is that when someone calls you You know, if you're talking about a phone service or if you're just like a client, you you know, one of the things I really like to do, you can either use a consultation chart, or you kind of just, you know, can look at a chart when it comes up. You can figure out, why are they calling me? What's going on? You have some sense of it. Like Nick talked about, like, what if they were going through a Mars retrograde transit on, you know, their Aries rising, and they may be dealing with the fallout of something, especially now that it's been triggered by a degree, going along with the eclipse that may have happened in Aries, right? So these are the things that you can start to piece together, because one of the fallacies I would see of, you know, many, again, I'll say contemporary astrologers online, is they think when a transit has happened, then it's just over. Well, Mercury retrograde is over, Venus retrograde is over, we can all go back to normal. That's not how
Mm,
it works, right? It still has it has significance, even maybe even years after.
mm,
So that's kind of one thing I would say to those who are starting. I see
yeah.
the question about, um, you know, what kind of phone services are out. I don't know.
I don't
I mean,
know. I'm surprised. You know, maybe GeoGlyn can enlighten us. You know, who's hiring?
well, I do
Uh,
know of one service. I mean, it's not a phone service, but I am working, this full disclosure, I am an advisor for it, so I don't want anyone to think like, oh, you're just
mm.
plugging it, whatever. I am plugging it because I am working with it. Astrostar,
Oh yeah,
which is a service um, that is operating and just had a soft launch. Um, so Astrostar is available on Android and also Apple. So you might look into that, but it's not a phone service, although they're going to have a service for astrologers where you can even be video streaming. So you can
right.
actually do a live reading, you know, with that. So I think more um, companies are going to be along that spectrum rather than just on the phone. But
Mm. I gotta say, you know, I much prefer uh, my career today. I enjoy my career today more than I did working the phone service,
mhm.
because the phone service, you really were getting people, you know, who didn't know. Well, sometimes you would get people who knew astrology. I mean, sometimes it went great. It went well and cultivated, you know, really good sort of early successes as a reader and all that. But in the sense that it went wrong was, you know, there's the time constraint, that's a lot of pressure, and yeah, people were just sort of, you know, coming in off the street and you know, wanting some kind of like immediate solve for, you know, the tonight's concern. They're not, you know, and it wasn't always like sort of the best use of astrology, I'd say. Whereas today, thanks largely to my exposure on the Astrology podcast, people know what I'm about, what I do, and so the people who come to me now are really like they're coming to me, and they're not just sort of phoning some stranger on the phone. Um,
Absolutely right.
yeah,
Yeah,
that
because
that really is, but you got to work towards that. It's you know,
you got to
and
start somewhere. I mean,
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
also a fan. You know, it doesn't have to be just on the phone. I have also done readings at stores,
hmm,
right? Where you have a little timer, you know, 10 minutes. Like I used to read at Origins, at Aveda, you know, places that seem hospitable. And you can actually, I don't know if it's still true, you could proposition them like, hey, I want to do readings. People do readings at cafes. The only thing is, you know, just to keep in mind, since we are talking about this, and maybe we'll have to have a whole different series on the life of an astrologer in terms of the career aspects of it. Um, just realize you're not going to have as much privacy. So if a
yeah,
client comes with a tricky situation, um, and you know the next table over, you got maybe some people who might eavesdrop, you know that could be an
yeah,
issue. So just
yeah,
keep that in
yeah.
mind. You know, if you decide to do that, and I can go more. I have a lot of stories related to that. I see also yes, there's Astrology Hub. They have Astrology Connect, Astrologer Connect. There's also some other service. Um, but yeah. Anyway,
Yeah, okay.
well, I can share
Uh,
in a minute my screen.
yeah,
Um, let me see. But before we get into that, um, what I do want to talk about, Nick, you and I have had a bit of a private conversation, in terms of this Venus retrograde. And I sent to you, because this is actually a prelude to what's going to happen with my talk, somewhat. I sent to you that quote from the book I was reading by Richard
Yes.
Smalley.
Yeah.
And I've been using that. And so just so you guys know, I've been thinking about the Venus retrograde as breaking the trance of consensus. So when I say breaking the trance of consensus, it's kind of like we kind of go through this humdrum of how we think things operate, whether we're talking about in terms of different ethnicities, as also that we've heard um, from Apurba, in terms of gender and with between men and women, or just in gender, period. All these different ways by which we have consensus about whatever comes under evaluation and breakage, we could say, during a Venus retrograde. Yeah, did that resonated for you, I think, as well, right, Nick?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, that's sort of something I've been parroting for quite a while with regard to Venus retrograde. Yeah, even the second episode of the Astrology podcast was called "Challenging Consensus," I think, because we were talking about retrograde like way back in 2012. Yeah, that's been the sort of the thesis of mine. Drawn in part by just the observation of how I mean, people are really seeing it this summer, but very often Venus retrograde is scandals, and just everyone sort of up in arms, and there's switching verdicts on the position of people. So people talking about Liz erupting in the news with celebrities, all the breakups and things like that, and that's the kind of thing I was seeing studying history.
Right.
And noticing. So, yeah, there you go.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's kind of one thing I want to say that becomes important. And so I'm going to give a truncated version of this talk.
Yeah,
Somewhat because, well, one, I mean, I've given, it's a longer talk. It's nearly about 2 hours, and we don't have 2 hours. And I think the key thing, following along the theme that Nick and I have been really looking into, and you can see my screen where it says right now, it says my aspirations. Does that
yeah,
make sense? You see
yeah.
that? Okay, great.
At the top,
Um,
you can hit the hide button at the top for that. Yeah,
oh,
then
here
that
you
just
go.
goes
Hide
away.
here.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, thank
I've
you.
only learned that recently myself, so it's a learning
Thank you.
curve.
Yeah. So these are the aspirations when I talk about what I want to do in terms of African American history. But one thing I do want to say about African American history is that I'm also including South America and the Caribbean, the West Indies, um, if only because, to kind of speaking of breaking trances, as a Black American, um, generally called African American, and I'm fine with saying Black American. We can get into a longer or different discussion about that. But in terms of African American, one thing I've observed with US Africans in America, in the United States, I should say, just is that we tend to center ourselves in a discussion about, what happens for Africans in the Americas. And you only need to learn one little fact that I think decenters that. There are more people of African descent in Brazil than there are in the United States. And so, and Brazil becomes very central to some measure of understanding the enslavement trade in the Western world, even though I'm not going to, belittle the impact that it also had in the Caribbean and also in terms of the Americas, United States, I should say specifically, and North, well, to some degree. I mean, I don't think it went too far north in terms of Canada. Canada actually eventually became like this because it was a more of a direct British colony. It became the place where many people aspired to escape, and many Africans who were enslaved aspired to escape, and with
It-
a lot of them landing in Nova Scotia,
no.
for example, and in Canada. You're about, I mean, Toronto and Ontario. What were you going to say, Nick?
Oh, I was just gonna say that, yeah, being part of the British Empire, slavery was illegal after 1834, just outright
Right.
criminalized. So yeah, people weren't necessarily treated nicely, but they weren't enslaved. They did make their way over. It's true, to Nova Scotia, also to Ontario. The Detroit Windsor corridor, was a popular. I think that was what the route that Harriet Tubman used, for instance, or used frequently. So yeah, they wound up in southwestern Ontario or Nova Scotia. They weren't, treated especially nicely, but it's true. They were not enslaved. They were free.
They at least were free. Right.
Yeah.
So I just want to give a brief definition of destiny. So to manage people's expectations, especially as I'm going to talk about some dimensions of this related to what Nick and I have been talking about. And just so you know, I can't see the chat. So if you're commenting, either Nick, I have to rely on you.
Yeah, I've
Um,
got mine on full screen so I can look at your slideshow. But
okay.
I'll keep my eye on it. I'll keep my eye
Okay.
on
Yeah,
it
I can't see
because so
anything.
that you focus. So far,
Okay.
we're good.
So I just want to briefly define destiny. I generally say, and Nick, you might remember I've said this, fate has two arms, and one of them is your own. Um,
That's a
so
great
it's,
quote.
it's kind of working, it's learning to work that arm. So I say destiny as that moment when you work your life, work that arm, um, your life chances and possibilities with that arm. So you forge your destiny out of the conditions of fate. That's how I might define it. So destiny is an act or the act of creation, though you certainly can describe it as a moment of discovery, whether you kind of, I'm making it happen or I discovered that this is happening. So I'm looking at the new world. Now, this is sometimes controversial for people, but it's believed by some scholars that Africans have had a presence in the Americas even before Columbus. So Abu Bakr II is believed to have abdicated his kingdom to sail to explore the limits of the ocean in the 14th century, the 1300s. And these are, I guess, very artistic reproductions of his ships. And it's believed that he actually arrived there. Now, again, I'm not going to say this is not without its controversies in terms of the African presence in the Americas.
Yeah,
These Olmec heads that are found in Mexico have,
very, very, very old.
yes. And
Really, really, really old.
yeah, dating back, centuries, maybe around the time of Abu Bakr, maybe even older.
Oh, no, older, older.
Yeah. And,
My understanding is, yeah, they're thousands of years old. Is my understanding.
so, but there's a question, and I kind of get into this here. One of the problems in terms of talking about race, and this is going to be just a brief excursion from, the main topic, but I think it's important to cover this. One, people often don't know that the very concept of race is a recent concept, meaning having emerged in roughly the 14th, 15th, then even more so developed into the 17th, 18th centuries. And I could go more into the weeds about it, but it's generally believed as more what we now call anthropologists and archaeologists were finding fossil remains of older folks. It was trying to rectify what science was discovering, what many believed from the Bible. So one of the reasons why we focus on the three main races, in terms of quote unquote Negroid or Africoid, quote unquote Mongoloid, and Caucasoid, is that it was making sense of Noah's three sons after the flood. I'm not kidding. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And so when we talk about this categorization into quote unquote three races, it comes initially from trying to justify how we have these different kinds of people, especially with the age of exploration from Europe, and categorize them. And then categorize them by their virtues, values, and all these other particular things. Now, the implication with that, though, is it becomes a posteriori, meaning that we start reviewing history in view of these racial dynamics that we come to understand, like I said, more from the 17th and 18th century. So the problem becomes when we start talking about the Olmec heads, and then even some of the features of indigenous people in the United States or in the Americas in general. There's this question. It's like, well, what are they? Right. So many times I would say that, if we were going with the broad spectrums of race, or not even broad spectrums, a narrow spectrum of race, many would say that they're Mongoloid. They're Asian, where some of them might look, I might be darker than I am, or have some actual, as you see here, the broad nose, the thick lips. So there's some who say, like, well, no, there have been those who are African who didn't come across the Bering Straits of Alaska, thousands and thousands of years ago, tens of thousands of years ago, but, may have come directly from Africa. I don't know. This is what I'm going to say. I don't know. I'm not going to say that that's just bunk, because I'm not qualified to go there. But at the same time, I think it does bring in questions about how race functions. I experienced the same thing in India. I would meet Indians who look like my sister, literally, and I'm,
Mhm.
like I said, a Black American, who look directly like my sister, and like, no, 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 I'm Caucasoid, right? Both in terms of color of skin, features like nose, lips, hair, kinkiness of the hair.
Mhm.
So the question of how race functions is kind of the big issue here in general. So one could still say there's an African presence. Now, this first chart I'm introducing is one of the first charts I came across, and it's in a book by, um, I should say, edited by Mark Penfield, called Astrology Looks at History. And there are a number of astrologers in there. Noel Teal is in there. And I was curious about the first Africans myself, and I had rectified a chart early on. And this must have been for me 2002, 2003, roughly around the time I met Nick, and I was getting involved with horoscopic astrology on MySpace and different folks. I'm gonna do a blast from the past for Nick. And I was starting to interact more with Moomin Bay. You remember
Oh, yeah.
Moomin?
I remember Mumin. How's he doing?
I don't know really.
Oh, okay.
He changed his name. Well, he doesn't use that name in public as much, and he became
Okay.
less of an astrologer and something else. Um, but anyway, I I I found this book, and I was a bit gobsmacked that Mark Penfield had also come pretty close to the same time as I came to with this chart. And why I want to start here, because I also have another chart. And I don't know, can you see my cursor flashing around? Is that
Yeah, yeah. Yep.
okay? Because I don't know how this particular app works, but I came away with the idea that it was, Scorpio rising, Mars directly opposing the moon and conjoined to Pluto in Taurus, and square with a T square to Venus. Now, this is pretty important. And because there's a similar chart that another astrologer, Vernon Robinson, has rectified. And I like his just as much, if not a little better, than this one, the one I rectified and that Mark also used. And I think it does speak to the conditions of these first Africans who were on a ship that, and they were, known as indentured servants, or became indentured servants once they landed in Virginia. But initially they were bound for, what would have been some measure of enslavement. But they were given the right to be indentured servants once they got to Virginia. And this does capture, if we were to use this chart as like, well, what happens to them and their descendants? Well, Mars, Pluto, Moon does speak of some measure of violation, some measure of loss, some measure of, you know, the intensity and the struggle that, and I say struggle, the back and forth, however you want to look at it, whether in terms of history or even for these initial indentured Africans. And with this T squared of Venus, and with Venus being at the top of the chart with this rectification, because we actually don't know, one thing I need to say, we don't know the date they officially arrived. We just know it was at the end of August, and we don't know the time.
Right.
So we certainly don't know the time. We don't, but what's unusual somewhat is that we don't even know the date. So this is my approximation. I'm going to show you another chart that's a different approximation,
I've
but
always
still very.
sorry to interrupt. I've always used August 30th. I thought it was at least narrowed down to the date. For some reason, I had that.
Yeah, I think as I've looked it up, and especially even with the 1619 project, I don't think there's been a clear date
Okay.
completely designated.
Yeah, no, I in the 1619 project. I have a copy, and they just say August.
Hmm.
Yeah, August 1619.
Yeah.
But I'm sure, I've got other sources, and I'm sure I've actually seen that date given. But
Okay.
I would have to
Yeah.
produce
If
that
you
in order
find
to.
it, I mean, because here's,
Yeah.
I'll come to. Let me see. Well, yeah, I'll use here. This is a rectification proposed by Vernon Robinson, and he uses the 25th.
Okay.
But what's fascinating, the moon changes, of course, because it's 5 days earlier.
Yeah.
But I think it's pretty much the same chart. Venus using whole sign houses ends up at the top of the chart.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it would probably be in the ninth house. It's still a morning star Venus, and the Mars Pluto opposition is still just as sharp.
Right.
So I think, it gives some similarities related to that. So here is this first African chart. I always like to start with that because that Venus, I think, proves really significant related to some dimension of how we could talk about, African American history or the history of Africans in the Americas.
Right.
Now, this is a close approximation. We do have a date. So this is Columbus coming into the Americas. This is given for October 12th, 1492,
Yeah.
sometime around sunrise. So the date is not questioned.
No.
I've given sunrise because that's what is put in the journals from.
That's what I would use as well. I think that's
Yeah,
pretty safe from my understanding. Of course, you note that Venus is retrograde.
yeah.
Um, these were back in the days when a red 3 was in Scorpio, red 3 Venus retrograde, the retrograde that now happens in Gemini.
Oh
Um,
wow, that makes sense. That
yeah,
is
yeah,
gone. Yeah, it's kind of. So yeah, it's a Venus retrograde, and if we, you can see that it ends up in the first house. Pluto, you know, later when we have the indentured servants is in Taurus, but here we have again the Scorpio marker and intensity. Now, one of the things I've done as some work with an astrologer named Gina Piccolo is that we published an article where we've come to see that Scorpio Taurus axis seems to be something that frequently happens or shows up in charts related to African Americans, which is interesting because it's also that dynamic between Venus, dun, dun,
mm,
dun, and Mars. And we give, a good plethora of examples in that article. And if you want to find the article, it's in the Mountain Astrologer. I'm blanking on the time frame. I think it's March, April. Um, but you can find it there, and pretty soon I'll be able to share it widely,
okay,
on my site. But the agreement with the Mountain Astrologer, for those who don't know, is that it for 6 months or so, it remains, even though it's my property and Gina's property, it remains something that we agree only is seen in the Mountain Astrologer for about 6 months. Anyway, so this chart is the moment, and you might notice because a lot of people don't know, like he didn't land in the United States,
no, never touched foot on it.
right? He
No,
never got to his voyage and entry into the Western Hemisphere, where he thought it was like, yeah, India, was more Bahamas. And then after that, he ventures other places elsewhere, like he goes to the Dominican Republic,
I think he goes to Cuba if I remember correctly.
Cuba after that,
Yeah,
and then he
yeah,
goes. I know he does spend time in what became the Dominican Republic,
yeah. But
in Hispaniola.
it's essentially the Caribbean, and that's that.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
and that's where he is. And so we see Venus is activated here, but so is this Mars. And again, because it's the Scorpio rising, Leo ends up at the top of the chart.
You were
Interesting.
also I
Yeah.
just wanted
Sorry.
to say you were also in eclipse season there. You can see there would have been a
Yep.
lunar eclipse less than a week earlier, and just over a week later, there'd be a solar eclipse. Sorry,
Yeah.
I just wanted
And
to point that out too.
no,
It's
please, you don't
yeah.
just you know, that's what we did with each other during
Yep,
your
yep.
discussion. And I
Yeah,
think
if
this is useful. Everyone, I think, benefits from that.
yeah.
And again, Scorpio rising. So this is the discovery of Brazil. Again, accurate time, and I should say date. It's given as 5:34 p.m. from the sources I've looked. And what's significant is not just the Scorpio rising, which is again another marker related to that, and the sun is in Taurus, again a sign of Venus. You might notice that it's an evening star for this Venus. I don't know what cycle she's in, Nick. Maybe you can tell us about that.
Oh, yeah, it's getting ready, for a red 4. It's getting ready to go retrograde. It's gonna be a red 4 retrograde. So this is either a black 5 or a red 4, one or the
Yeah,
other.
yeah.
But the other thing it's about 2 Saturn returns after Columbus. Saturn was
Mhm.
also in Aquarius during
There you go.
Columbus, and Jupiter's in Gemini for Brazil. Where's Jupiter for Columbus? Go back to Columbus.
Yeah,
Where's
Jupiter's in
Jupiter?
Leo.
Jupiter's in Leo. Yeah, so it's just shy because 59 years is the second Saturn return. Even though that Jupiter's in Gemini, you know that it's going to zip through Cancer and it'll be in Leo uh, by um, um, by the autumn of 1551. By a year and a half later, Jupiter will be in Leo, even though it's in Gemini, and they'll be because the second Saturn return is also a Jupiter return. That's the big difference. Whereas the first Saturn return is a Jupiter opposition. Sort of the discombobulating effect of the Saturn return is your Jupiter is as far from the natal position as possible. But the second one is more sort of consolidating. It's the two planets coming together.
Yeah, it's the
So
only
this,
time that happens.
yeah. So
Mhm.
this is close to. It's just shy. I mean, it's a Saturn return, and very nearly the Jupiter return as well as Columbus.
And you can see here, I mean, there's some amazing things. Saturn is square to the ascendant. It's obviously opposite because we're going toward sunset. It's square to Neptune, so it's a T square to the sun. Um, the other thing, for those who are wondering how Nick does his magic, other than just memorizing the ephemeris, one
Magic.
thing to know, speaking of how he knew for, those, this is a quick astro lesson. Well, how does he know it zips through Cancer? So we know Jupiter moves faster through signs of short ascension in the northern hemisphere, and I guess this is more the southern hemisphere, but okay. Um,
Yeah.
but he zips through particular signs in the northern hemisphere, um, and those signs of short ascension are from Capricorn to Gemini, and then long ascension where the signs rise slower in the northern hemisphere. This is important because it changes when you go to the southern hemisphere. Is that it goes from Cancer to Sagittarius. So if you've been wondering, like, well, why did Jupiter move so fast through Aquarius and Pisces and Aries and double back? This is why. And it does get faster as it goes from Capricorn, and it seems to go very fast through Pisces and Aries, somewhat through Taurus. Starts to slow down as we get to Gemini and Cancer, and by the time that we get to Leo, Virgo, especially Virgo to Libra, Jupiter's going to be at its slowest, right?
Yeah. Uh,
So, yeah, go
the,
on.
I was just going to say the other thing though is there's its relationship to the sun, because planets really change speed. It really varies, and the closer to the sun a planet is, the faster it moves. And Jupiter in particular, like you can see, the sun will be making its conjunction to Jupiter in about 3-4 weeks after this date, and in that time, Jupiter is going to transit really fast as the sun approaches it and as it, eventually surpasses it. So part of the reason, like that's when Jupiter transits the greatest amount of degrees, is during that period when it's closest to the sun, the month prior to and the month following, especially. So you just know it's going to move through Gemini really quickly. It's going to be in Cancer, I'm sure, before the end of 1550.
Right.
That would
And
be my estimate.
yeah, and I mean, and how fast does Jupiter move? What is
Yeah.
it? Like
Well, that's
30,
just it.
30
Just
to
that's just
45,
it.
like at
Depending
that
on
point.
Yeah, depending on how close it is to the sun. But keep in mind, like since it's in Gemini, it's not going to station retrograde until the sun's in Libra, which is
Correct.
months later. And by that point, it might even just be getting ready to go into Cancer, in which case it won't station retrograde until it's in the sun's in Scorpio. The other
Right.
thing I wanted, just as an aside, this Venus is actually 2 days away from the red. This is a red 4. I knew it was going to be close. Yeah, even 500 years away, I can sort of approximate what interval it's in.
Yeah.
So that again, like Columbus, that's Venus about to go retrograde. Venus was full retrograde, and this is Venus just
About to go
about to.
retrograde.
Yeah.
And again, you're like, well, what does this signify and why is this important, especially talking about Venus retrograde related to this? And so, one thing to know is this discovery of Bahia is very important in the development of Portuguese ascendancy during this period. So, the Portuguese were among the pioneers, if I could put it that way, related to enslavement and the slave trade, especially related to Africans, because it was those the first crop, and I'm going to go more into this in just a bit, that the first crop that the Portuguese kind of got more into developing was sugar just off the coast of Africa in the Canary Islands, or not Canary Islands, but farther south. And then as they went through this era of exploration, they land in Brazil, what we now know as Brazil. And Bahia becomes and still is this bedrock of African history. And when I say African history, there are many people who in Bahia who still are connected to African traditional religions. Um, and in terms of some of the practices and aspects of the spirituality. So Bahia is very important in general Brazilian history, specifically related to African history. And again, we have this connection with Venus related to it. This is the Sibley chart, a well contested chart um, among astrologers. Some use it, some don't. I'm a firm believer. I think Nick, you share this opinion too. I think it's fine to use multiple charts related to a nation or
Oh yeah, 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 yeah.
particular moment.
It's kind of a nationalist idea to think like of a chart, to think of a nation as having being sort of a person,
Right.
Um, I think it's a
Yeah.
bit. I think it's a bit wobbly. Everyone has a very different notion of what a country is.
Because countries also go through monumental changes. You could take Russia, you could take France, you could take the UK, you could take any number of countries, including this one, the United States, and you could find multiple charts that will speak to it. Russia, whether
Yeah.
you're talking about which Russia chart are you talking about, from the Bolshevik Revolution or from
Well, that's
you know,
just it. Or
yeah,
even the Romanov chart, goes back 400 years, but even that is kind of like, fairly modern Russian history.
correct,
Like I mean, there was a Russia before the Romanovs too, you can maybe go back to Ivan the Terrible for like the beginning of the sort of what would become the Russian dynasty. And that does consolidate the place into what we recognize as a country now. But even before that, like what about the Mongol invasions and how that shaped
yep,
the culture and and everything that followed. So history is so, it's so vast. And I think when we make these national charts, yeah, Russia is a great example because like what you're going to use a chart, cast in 1991 or 92 to explain like Russia in terms of like not the nation state, but the people, the land, the history that's supposed to be defined by this one chart cast in 1992. It just doesn't make sense. They
correct,
go back centuries, and my feeling is better to, I know it's a nice shorthand idea that we can just look at one chart and not have to bother with a lot of like learning history and dates and studying wars and prime ministers and all that stuff like I do. But I really think like, no, you got to sort of have a sense of the whole astrological journey. And this shorthand trick is not worth the shortcut. You know, the journey itself is it's like what you were saying about casting charts by hand, learning how to cast charts by hand. Of course, you can do it by computer. It's faster, it's more efficient, handier, all that stuff. But still, you got to know how to do it. You know, like it really, with the education it gives you, even if you're not going to do it in practice, the education it gives you is really important. And I feel the same way about studying nations. You know, if you just sort of look at a natal chart and try to measure everything against the natal chart, the so-called natal chart, it's a little easier with America because there is just this one regime effectively from 1789 to the present. Ironically, the oldest, you know, democracy on the planet, for that reason. But you know, because most of these other countries, you know, places, you know, France, Russia, whoever, who've been, you know, Iran, you know, like what, you're going to cast a chart for Iran, like all of Persian history going back millennia, and you're going to cast some chart from 1979. To explain who they are. So yeah, just history's too vast. I think it's a limited, it's a handy crutch. It's not unlike you were talking earlier about the zodiac, and I have the same feeling. Like you're absolutely right. Like the signism thing is really great when you're first studying astrology, and it helps get you in the door. But then it can very easily become a trap and a sort of, you know, as it gets you to stage one, but you don't want to drag it with you into stage 2, 3, and 4 of your astrological education. It's you know, it can easily sort of take over the dialogue. There's that great meme, you know, the meme using Steven Crowder at a desk and like blah 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 changed my mind. You know that one?
Yeah, yeah.
And it was a meme that said, astrology is just space racism, change my mind, or something like Egyptian space racism or something like that. And that made me laugh because you know, obviously it's not racism in the sense that it doesn't have the history, but signism does take that same notion, the idea that you can be that reductive in trying to understand human beings, that you can just sort of group them into this pre-packaged notion of who they are, and that everyone's going to adhere to that tag, you know, for the sake of your of maintaining your own worldview, very narrow worldview, and very easy to just sort of yeah, reduce people to these sort of labels.
Yeah,
And
sorry.
even though it doesn't have the political harm of racism, you're kind of doing the same thing. The thing that, like, when we challenge racism, we're like you want to be able to see the person and not just the label. And that's the beautiful thing about astrology, is that, and why I'm saying what I'm saying is the sign, yeah, it helps you get in the door. It helps you sort of understand these 12 types. But really, at the end of the day, astrology absolutely speaks to the unique individual quality of a human being, what makes them absolutely different from every other person. And that's where astrology is really interesting, is the back end of that whole process, not the early, when you're just, you know, getting a grip on the fact that this thing exists, and it's a way to look at people.
Yeah, I mean, it also will affect your analysis, not just in terms of how you're looking at the person. So one of the charts I love to show to my students is a chart. I'm not giving the whole chart just now, but it's the chart of someone who's a Gemini rising, Sun in Taurus, um, with also Venus and Saturn and their North Node conjoined in Aries, with the Moon in Pisces at the top of the chart. And so I show them this chart as to kind of challenge and open up their sinology. I'm like, okay, describe this person. And if they're really deep into sinology, not paying attention to the aspects and positions and essential dignities, they may say, like, especially with Moon being in Pisces, that this is a really sensitive person, a person who seems to care about people, you know, and maybe they might, like, you know, yeah, compassion and all these other things. I'm like, okay, thank you for describing Timothy McVeigh. Who, those who don't know, he's the Oklahoma bomber.
Yeah.
Who, and you know, and I'm not going to hide my bias here. Okay, I'm not trying to be objective, especially with him, because I think he's POS. Like he he had a choice, and he made a very conscious choice. This is something he spells out, you know, in his confessions and everything else. He made a conscious choice. He actually could have set off his bomb at night the day before, where practically no lives would have been lost, and his statement could have still had effect in terms of challenging the government, which he wanted to do. But he made a conscious choice to do it when the building, the Alfred Murrah building, was open, and children were actually in the building for the daycare. So he bombed it while people were in full swing in that building, working and playing and with their children and everything else. So I use him as a very conscious example to break open this idea, like, well, if you have Pisces involved in your chart, you're a pretty sensitive person. It depends. The other chart I love to show is like the chart of a Cancer rising with a sun in Pisces, and I think a moon in Libra, and I'm like, okay, talk to me about this person. Oh yeah, he's a caring person, blah blah blah. Yeah, he went into a caring profession, but I wouldn't say he's a caring person because this is Joseph Mengele.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, you have to really be careful. And here, when we look at the United States, this chart, I think a lot of it fits. This is why I think the Sibley chart, even though, some say like, how did this chart come about? Because people critique like, how did he know? Because Ebenezer Sibley was a Brit. He wasn't in the United States. He wasn't, he was, I think it just came. Some even say that this is not even the accurate time in which the Declaration of Independence was signed.
Oh, it absolutely is not. It absolutely
Right.
is not. It's not.
So,
The 4th isn't an important day in history. Like a. Anyway, sorry. Please keep going.
no, it's okay. No, that's all. I mean, I think people benefit from knowing that. Hold on.
Yeah. If you asked John Adams, he would have thought July 2nd was like the momentous day. And then, a lot of the signatures on the Declaration, it was done gradually over the course of July
correct.
and August. And so, yeah, I mean, I get that the chart works. I've seen all kinds of very interesting presentations that tie it all together very nicely. The arguments are great. I enjoy the conversation. I just have some resistance to the like total commitment to a singular chart.
Right.
No, I like the Sibley. I'm always game to have someone sort of talk about the Sibley or any of the other July 4th charts and sort of say their piece about them, because people have, there's a lot of really interesting arguments and all around.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And people saying like, well, yeah, it fits. The United States is a Cancer. I mean, yeah, kind of. I mean, not even kind of. It fits, but this is where you also have to broaden your scope and understanding of Cancer. And this is why I always encourage my students to get more away from keywords in learning astrology and more have a personal encounter, especially with the planets. Because one thing you probably are learning from Nick and I, and then also probably also Patrick and others who appear on the stream, is the emphasis. Like, I think real astrology is more about the planets than it is about the signs. And because signs can change depending on the zodiac you use. And I think, those particular things, but yeah, you could argue it's a Cancer nation, but it's also a Cancer nation in the sense that it's defensive, in the sense that it's accrued the most weapons that we can document probably in human history, right? But surrounded by 2 oceans. Like, this country is not in immense danger of being invaded by anybody. Okay.
Right. Although when this chart is cast, you're not on 2 oceans.
Yeah, right. We're not on 2 oceans. We have 1 ocean still facing our quote unquote enemy. But yes, but the mentality, even from this moment, is still with us.
Yeah, no, I don't dispute the thesis. I was just being...
So I mean, we still have that, but we have to broaden our spectrum of it. Now, the reason why I'm including this chart, Virginia Dare, because she's one of the earliest recorded births. Recorded is a key thing. I'm not saying that she was the only one. Recorded in what becomes the United States of Roanoke, Virginia. It was even just a colony, and the time is, I just made it up. It's not, I'm just using a noon chart.
This is the colony that vanished, right? I mean,
right.
Yeah.
And I thought it was really interesting, to look at the Venus, Jupiter, Neptune conjunction. And again, this is me not so much as looking at African American. Virginia Dare is not Black, by the way. She is, as far as I know, a white girl. Um, I just thought this was really interesting as a way of looking at and documenting like this story with Venus, and so it's going along with again strong Scorpio related themes, even if only related by rectification and conjecture. Dealing with Mars, Saturn as a kind of a theme, and emphasis on Venus and Mercury, experiences of pleasure and thought. Um, more, we could even say Jupiter's in the mix in some sense because this was a colony where people were looking for some measure of exploration. It's called a new world or the new world for a reason. And then dealing with Venus being particularly salient, and then some measure of Mercury, it's interesting in terms of the commerce and then expanse. And then if we go into, especially the African aspect of it, from indentured servitude to enslavement, this is where we start to see something very different happen. So the Crusades, mainly from what we now, term some measure the Middle Ages, introduced Europeans to the wonder of spices and refinements from with sugarcane, specifically the ability to crystallize the plant into a sweet salt. And then we see that Spain and Portugal emerged out of hundreds of years of Moorish rule and began, excuse me, to conquer and settle islands and archipelagos off the coast of Africa. So this includes the Canary Islands, Madeira, Sao Tome, Principe. And initially, they focus on developing one particular crop, which is sugarcane, and then exporting to other parts of Europe for consumption and refinement. And what happens with this cultivation of sugarcane becomes the pathway for Nick and I talked about this before for other crops, from cotton to tobacco to all kinds of things that start to crop up that wasn't as plentiful um, in Europe or other parts of what now was becoming the European world, even in the New World. So again, I showed this chart, but this is also the chart that is rectified by Vernon Robinson. And what strikes me again is dealing with this Venus at the top of the chart. We have, and we're talking about, the sweet tooth for slavery, but also this that it starts with sugar. And another time I probably will extend this presentation and maybe even just do a presentation on sugar, because I've done some research on, and I think some other historians have been equally fascinated, not so much on Venus, but on sugar and how it's played out in monumental changes in our history. Like, what do you mean by monumental changes in our history? Not just in terms of enslavement, but we could argue if I actually was, more into nutrition and kind of being the nutritional guru or whatever.
Right.
Just
Not very
in terms
healthy.
of how it's affected our diet.
Yeah.
Everywhere. And what sugar has done, not just in terms of our diet, then how that's affected our health. The acronym for the standard American diet is SAD, and I think it's real commentary. And a lot of the standard American diet is actually loaded with lots of sugar. And you might even say, like, well, we've taken high fructose corn syrup out. Yeah, kind of, but it's still loaded with other things that are based on sugar.
I don't know if you have this in the States now, but in Canada, you now have the choice between like a regular Coke or a Mexican Coke. The difference being the Mexican Coke is made with cane sugar instead of like a syrup. And so like, I go out for, Mexican takeout or something like that. And there's like the choice between the two. I don't know if you have that in the States now too, but
I've seen it.
I saw it in Montreal and it's here in Vancouver too. So it's kind of an interesting new thing. I don't know if it's because of NAFTA or whatever, but
I've seen it, but I'm also in New Mexico. So
well, yeah, no, exactly. I'm in New Mexico. You might expect that, but I'm in Canada, so it's
right.
an
No,
interesting thing.
and that's what I mean. But but when I say why I mention that as more exception than rule, because I don't know if it's like in New York,
right,
or other parts of the states.
Sure,
but
Iowa or whatever,
or Iowa, right. And I haven't even been to Iowa, so maybe there's that. So this is where during my presentation I evoked this guy You know,
Handsome person. Oh my goodness.
right? Isn't he?
I'm woof,
With
woof.
Ray-Bans on. Look at you. You know,
Yeah, yeah.
I picked a good picture of you, didn't I?
Yeah, yeah, that's in India. That's when
Yeah, I know.
we were being rock stars in India. An astrology conference in India means you're getting chased around by paparazzi and all that stuff. Literally, like it's the autographs, the works. It's really something.
How many times did people come up to you asking for their palm to be read, though?
No, never, never. No, no.
No?
They no, 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 no,
When
not
I'm
one.
in India, they're like, "Oh, Jyotishi," you know, and they go like, "Hey, look," you know, and I'm like,
Oh,
even
actually, it did happen once. It happened in the airport. We were, I think, going from Varanasi to Goa. It was anyway. It was a flight within India, but I came up against this very stern-looking Indian soldier, holding a machine gun, who wants to see my papers and all that. And he's, treating me kind of coldly while he's looking at my stuff. And he says, "What do you do?" I say, "I'm an astrologer." And suddenly the ice melts like nothing else. And he did prefer his palm to me, and asked me to look at it. I mean, it was really an amazing. The whole demeanor of the guy just changed, and he went from being a
yeah,
hostile guy with a machine gun to just being warm and welcoming, and oh yeah, go on your way, sir. Deferential even. So
yeah,
it was really something else. Definitely, whether you're actually an astrologer or not, if you're ever traveling India, tell people you are one, just to
and you'll get better treatment.
yeah, you will, yeah,
And we're not just making that up. You know, I've been in India at least twice,
yeah, me
planning a
too.
third trip, and it's real. You know,
Oh
and
yeah.
we're
That's real, all right.
I have been asked in different places, but it mainly was in the airport as I traveled. Like, what are you doing? And I would say, Jyotishi. They're like, oh, So anyway, getting back to this slide,
Yes.
so there's obviously, I mean, I've presented this in various permutations over the last, I would say, maybe 3 or 4 years,
Okay.
and I would make the modification now that like also creates dislike. I probably would say more about breaking the trance of consensus, but it brings back what Nick and I have talked about in 3 other iterations about what happens with Venus. So it kind of then, kind of to tie it together, affection, confection, and disaffection. So we could look at this, especially even the explosion of the BLM movement from Ferguson, Missouri, erupts um, during the superior conjunction of Venus, October 2014, at a solar eclipse. So Venus, again, also relates to the sweetness of life, hence the beginning of our journey with sugar, but also when I say confection, but like how we have this sense of affection and disaffection. Um, in this chart, I believe this is from, let me see. Yeah, this is, uh, I think, related to with George Zimmerman and him
Yeah.
getting off.
Yeah. This looks like
So
2012.
yeah, so this is the Venus retrograde of that particular.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating about that, as a statement, not that we need proof per se, but a statement of consistency,
Mm.
is that I knew, and this is, even though it was somewhat controversial because someone didn't fully understand it, as we said during one of our first talks, I knew 2020, when Venus was going to be in Gemini again,
Mm.
something was going to go off the rails related to race.
Right.
And sure enough, we had even a more monumental moment
Oh,
with George
Jesus.
Floyd.
Yeah.
So this is just to give you an example of, how Venus really relates to this. But like I said, we've covered this. So with Venus as a clear signifier in the first African's chart, and according to ideas presented by Nick Dagan Best, we might see racism and its capitalistic roots as a statement about consumption, taste, and affinity. Again, I don't think this works in contrast or contradiction to what we've been saying, breaking the trance of consensus. But if we wanted to isolate it, and more especially related to a broader idea, not just in terms of racism, it's kind of more about this consumption, taste, and affinity. You know, what is like us, what is not, and then even some aspects of consumption. And you're like, well, why are you talking about consumption, even related to Venus? Well, it does come back to taste. And the broader acquisition of spices, starting with sugar and then other things, really changed how we, had access as an example, to food or foodstuffs um, for longer or shorter periods of time. So before, our predecessors, our ancestors, you basically had the shelf life of the food, the vegetables or the beef or whatever, for however long it could stand, whether you decided to salt it and then like have it for the winter and other things, or however you could seek to preserve it naturally. But as consumption became much more important and became all consuming, forgive the pun, as we go from the 19th and the 20th century, especially with industrialization, we have this massive ability to produce and then preserve things for greater and greater consumption. This actually does have consequences related to our dynamic with each other, both in terms you see early on with racism and the development of enslavement, but even other things that have happened. You're like, well, what do you mean in terms of other things that have happened? Oh, well, here's my iPhone, right? We all love our devices, right? And we enjoy them. Well, the cost of consumption for this relates to the precious metals and other things that have to be dangerously extracted by people who may or may not look like us, um, who put their lives at risk in order to kind of have these, and be paid relatively cheaply in order to be able to do this. Or the
Oh,
kids,
I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't mean to, uh, uh, critique that, but I mean, that's underselling it. It's appalling. It just, it
right?
kills
It's
me.
fair,
My life is, as connected to this technology as anyone else's. I'm as, I think of us, just on a side note, we talk about Thomas Jefferson and his hypocrisy, rightfully so, to sort of to denounce slavery while still being a slave owner. But I think we're a society of Thomas Jeffersons now, because we're collectively, participating in what amounts to, you can use a razor to try to define whether we're talking about slavery or not in this instance. I see no reason why not. I mean, okay, so
fair.
I don't personally own a human being. That disconnects me from the direct complicity. But no, I think, this is where, it's fine. I'm not saying we shouldn't denounce Jefferson for his hypocrisy, but I think we should also acknowledge we're collectively, a global society of Thomas Jeffersons who, and we're in this position where, I mean, I don't know what else to do. Of course, I denounce what's being done in the Congo to mine cobalt, and yet with the other side of my mouth, I'm like, oh yeah, I got to get another tablet. I got to get another iPad, and
Right.
I'm
And
going
we
to
have
need
to,
my next iPhone, and I can't possibly be who I am without these things. And this is where we're at.
and it's the cost of consumption. I mean, not that we're I'm trying to guilt trip anyone,
No,
including
no,
myself, but
no.
it is recognizing that this first taste that we have been talking about related to Venus is so much broader, and its implications, in terms of how things have happened. Well, I, when next we meet, or when next we decide to meet, I could go more into looking at some particular
I
rebellions and
I can't wait.
resistance.
I can't
Yeah,
wait. I know you have to leave earlier today,
yeah, I
and
do.
we knew we weren't going to finish.
Right.
But Sam, I just, I
Ooh, I'm
love this
creating something.
conversation. Whoops, we just have to
Yeah,
unshare you.
yeah. I have
That's
to
fine.
unshare. Let
Here,
me.
I've unshared you. That's fine.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Sam, you're welcome anytime if you want to come back next week and pick up where we left off. That's up to your schedule. If you need to wait 2 weeks, that's fine. I love having you on. This is the whole idea of doing these live streams, is just to like keep in touch with my friends, have the conversations I love to have with them anyway. But maybe some people would love to just sort of be a fly on the wall for these conversations. So that's the whole point of doing this, and talking to you is one of my favorite things to do as an astrologer. So anytime, my friend.
Thank you.
I certainly, please do come back and finish this. Let's not leave our viewers hanging. Don't leave me
Yeah,
hanging.
right.
But do come
Right?
back. If not next week, then as soon as you can, and we look forward to it.
Same here. Yeah, we'll figure that
All
out
right.
privately. But thank you,
Okay. Sounds
everybody.
good. Thank you,
All right.
everyone, for participating. I'm just going to look at the questions quickly.
Do we have
All right. Good.
questions? Oh, thank you. Oh, someone has weighed in and said the astrology. I wonder who's this person
Oh,
from the astrology podcast. Great stuff, guys. I don't know who that is. Hey,
that
Chris.
guy. That guy. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good. Good. You know, Chris works so hard producing astrology podcasts, and
Oh,
then on
he
his
does.
downtime, he comes and watches my live stream.
Oh, this is wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And yeah, we'll be back. I'll be back with Patrick next Sunday, and next Monday I'll either be here with Sam or on my own, and we'll have to wait for Sam to come back when he can. We'll figure that out. We don't know what the
Yeah, well,
situation
I'll
is right
figure that
now.
out. Yeah.
Who are you? Find you.
So people can find me at unlockastrology.com. If you want to write me, unlockastrology@gmail.com. And on Twitter, I'm unlockastrology, all one word. And then on Instagram, which I'm doing a little more, it is SF, F as in Fred, SF Reynolds. And for those, I can't put anything in the chat. Some guys have asked me, or some people ask me about Astrostar.
Oh,
Astrostar, their logo it's this Astrostar. I mean, I don't know if you guys can see
they
it.
can find it in the App Store.
They can find it in the App Store, and they also can find it on Android.
All right, cool.
All right.
All right. Thank you. My name is Nick
Thank
Dagan
you.
Best. I can be found at nickdaganbestastrologer.com. And yeah, tune in next Sunday and Monday for the next live streams. And thank you, Sam. Have a great day.
Thank
You,
you, buddy.
everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone.
All the best.